Ja, det jo flott å se at folk står og prater og nyter både det ene og det andre. Vi prøver å holde timeplanen sånn noenlunde, sånn at vi får litt god tid til kveldsmat også, når vi kommer dit. Men bare fortsett samtalene etterpå. Det bra det at det blir talt litt sammen. Så hvis alle har mulighet til å ta plassene sine igjen, så skal vi straks gi ordet til Robert Carter. Kan hende at dere som står helt ute i gangen der og hører dette, kanskje kunne sagt fra til de som står ute også. All right. I think you can just start, Robert, and then people will probably come in very quickly here. So, give Robert a warm applause.
Okay, ready? I very rarely get to talk about genetics twice in the same day. Usually when I start talking about it, I can't stop. So I had to keep my first talk short, but now I have a second chance. So this is everything I didn't tell you last time, and I'll have 10 hours after this that I can't tell you at all. The question is, who is this y-chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve that the evolutionists talk about? Are they the same thing as the biblical Adam and Eve? How do we deal with this? And let's get some explanations. First of all, understand this. The Bible absolutely demands that all humans come from one man, the man named Adam. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. And right after that, Genesis chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up his place with flesh. And the rib the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman. Of course, the names of these people are Adam and Eve. You've read this before, right? Okay. Do you understand that the Bible demands that there is an Adam and Eve? Evolutionary theory is neutral. It doesn't matter either way. They could have an Adam and Eve or not an Adam and Eve. They discovered it for us, but they don't demand an Adam and Eve. We do. Okay? And yet, a lot of very significant Christians don't believe this. This is Dr. Francis Collins. He ran the Human Genome Project. That man spent $3 billion. He was the director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health. Of course, he was at the helm during the COVID epidemic, and he recently retired. But he's also an evangelical Christian. And he wrote this, someone wrote this about him. Christianity Today magazine had an article called The Search for the Historical Adam, and they quote this. Collins' 2006 bestseller, The Language of God, a Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Okay, hold it. You're about to hear a scientist give you evidence of why he believes the Bible. What do you think you're going to hear? Right? He's a Christian who believes the Bible. He's going to give you evidence for why he believes it. What do you think you're going to hear? Well, he reported scientific indications that anatomically modern humans emerged from primate ancestors, perhaps 100,000 years ago, long before the Genesis time frame, and originated with a population number something like 10,000, not 2 individuals. I'm confused. What are those numbers? What is that 10,000? What is that 100,000? That's the evolutionary out of Africa story, where they claim that Homo erectus lived in Africa, and a few 100,000 years ago, they went into an extreme population bottleneck with an effective size of about 10,000 people. And for some very long time, they're in this 10,000-ish people window, and that's when Homo sapiens evolved. But there was never 2 people. There's many people. In that sort of a situation, It's natural for an Adam and an Eve to arise by accident. So imagine that there's a giant war, and everyone in the world is killed, except the people in this room. And then we go out and we repopulate the world. That means that our children are going to have to marry each other, right? But every time a man doesn't have a son, his last name disappears. If our population remains small, the last names more and more disappear. Eventually, there will only be one last name, probably Carlson. Only one Y-chromosome. Oh. The smaller the population, the faster it happens. In a very large population, like 10,000 or more individuals, it would take a very long time, which is why they need deep time and millions of years to have that 10,000 people for a couple of 100,000 years for an atom to randomly arise. They don't believe there was one man who started people. Just one lucky man just happens to be the father of all the men alive today. That's why they need that bottleneck, because without the bottleneck, it will never happen. The same thing is true for the mitochondria. Women pass down their mitochondria to their children, men don't. So anytime a woman has no daughters, her mitochondria disappears if she only has sons. And that happens all the time. And so eventually in a small population, enough women don't have any daughters, their mitochondria disappears, this one disappears, that one disappears, that one disappears, and all of a sudden, poof, there's only one left. That's mitochondrial Eve. William Lane Craig is a famous Christian apologist, a world-famous theologian. And yet, he believes in deep time and millions of years. And in a debate with an atheist named Frank Zindler, who ran a big atheist organization in the United States, this is what Frank Zindler said in the middle of the debate, knowing that William Lane Craig believes in millions of years and doesn't believe in an Adam and Eve. So the atheist said, if there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there's no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. You know, Charles Darwin and his friends knew that formula. We have the letters they were writing back and forth. It is clear that even in the 1800s, they realized that by getting rid of the first atom, you could get rid of the last atom. Therefore, evolution is very much a philosophical war, even before it's a scientific war. And there's a lot of very deep theology wrapped up with this evolution question. So let's treat Adam and Eve very carefully. Because if we make a mistake, we might have a giant theological problem on our hands. So I'm going to give you now 7 reasons to believe in the biblical Adam and Eve. Some of these will be easy, some will be hard, some will be mathematical, some will be philosophical. Okay? First one, a little bit of math. Explosive population growth. You probably have seen maybe in some evolutionary website or maybe a documentary where they show human population growth over time. We have 8 billion people alive today. So I got this, actually this is old data. This is about 20 years ago, there's only 7 billion people. But then I have this chart going way back, and about 10,000 years ago, maybe there was 1 million people across the world. But then someone invented farming. And food equals babies. And the more food, the more babies, and the population grew and grew until we have today. You've seen something like that? Hey, if there were 10 million, if there were 1 million people alive at any time, and if the human average generation time is about 30 years, that's 1 million dead people every 30 years. Stretch this back now for 100,000 years. You're talking about billions of bodies that don't exist in historical record. Where are the graves? Where are the campfires? Where are the enclosures in the little cities? There are some really old stuff in the archaeological record, fine. But it's as if millions of people never existed, as if this is not true. So we can discount the earlier stuff. Now consider this. How long ago was Noah's flood? How well do you know your biblical timeline? About 4,500 years ago. Okay. 4,500 years ago, 6 people founded the human race. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. 6 people? There's 8 billion people today. How do we go from 6 to 8 billion? By doubling the population every 150 years. That's it. Human populations grow much more quickly than that. Think about it. 150 years after the flood, there's 12 people. 300 years after the flood, there's 24 people. 450 years after the flood, there's 48 people. We're not getting there very fast, are we? But because of the laws of mathematics, you keep doubling that population. It goes shoo, and you get 8 billion people alive today. Therefore, the number of people in the world is trivial to explain in the biblical timeline. It's the evolutionists who have a problem in explaining all the missing people. Because billions upon billions of people would have been alive. Homo sapiens people would have been alive in the last 100 or 200,000 years. Where's the evidence? No, the biblical story makes more sense in this case. Okay, point number 1. The math okay there? Point number 2. There's a general lack of y-chromosome and mitochondrial DNA diversity. Now, what's a y-chromosome? What's a mitochondrial DNA? This is a photograph of a person's genome. A genome is all the DNA in the cell. When the cell is about to divide, the chromosomes, the DNA, compacts. And when you stain the cell, you can look under a microscope and you can see the chromosomes. This is called a karyotype. You take a photograph of the cell, and then they would cut the chromosomes out and line them up. This is how they used to diagnose Down syndrome and other chromosomal abnormalities. But look at this. There's pairs. There's 2 copies of chromosome 1, 2 copies of chromosome 2, 2 copies of chromosome 3, because you got 1 set of DNA from your mother and 1 set from your father. So all your chromosomes are paired until you get to the end. These are called the sex chromosomes, the Y chromosome and the X chromosome. Girls, you have 2 X chromosomes. Only one of them, though, is active. One of them is turned off. Boys, you have an X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Now, when I was in even graduate school, I was taught, oh, the Y chromosome is a vestigial piece of DNA. It's all shriveled up. There's only a couple of genes on it. It's irrelevant. Men are superfluous. Sorry, superfluous. Was that a big word? All right, sorry. Men are not necessary. Okay. But it turns out, again, the phrase we now know, the Y chromosome is a master switch. There might be only one really important gene. It's called the SRY gene that causes testosterone production. But the presence of the Y chromosome causes thousands of other genes on all of the other chromosomes to change how much they're expressed. And it affects men versus women. I mean, men don't look like women, do they? We don't act like them. Men don't act like women, right? We have different outer parts. We have different inner parts, even though all the parts are the same. Have you ever heard that the embryo growing in the mother's womb is a female until at some point in time? Everyone starts out girl. Have you heard that? Okay, that's not true. Not at all true. As the baby is growing, the cells that become the egg and sperm cells aren't even in the baby. They leave the embryo, and they hang out on this thing called the allantois. And as the baby's developing, ambiguously, there's no girl and boy parts there. Now, there's always an X chromosome and Y chromosomes, but you can't tell the difference. At some stage of development, those little reproductive cells will form a line. They go dun 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 dun. Not really. But they form a line, they migrate across the embryo, they go inside, they find the reproductive organs, They invade it, and then they start producing hormones. And that's when you have male versus female. It's not true that the baby growing up is female. Not at all true. Now, there's parts where the sexual organs are starting to form, the outer sexual organs, and you can't tell what it is yet. But then it'll fold this way and poke out, or fold the other way and poke in. That's where you get male versus female. Sorry, so much graphic details, parents, but this is biology. Okay, so you got the idea? Y chromosomes and X chromosomes? There's another chromosome. It's outside the nucleus in the cell. It's called the mitochondrial DNA. It's only 16,569 letters long. Now, chromosome 1 is this long. It's 250 million nucleotides long. It's a foot long. Sorry for the English measurement. It's 1/3 of a meter long. The mitochondrial DNA is tiny. And according to a lot of science, you only get it from your mother. So Y chromosome, obviously you only get it from your father, because if you have one, you're a man. That means that anytime a mutation occurs on a Y chromosome, it can be passed to the son, and then to the next son, to the next son, which means that a new branch of the family tree forms. The same is true in the mitochondria. If a woman has a mutation, she passes on to her daughter, that's a brand new branch in the family tree. And we can look at all these branches, like for the Y chromosome, and we can see instantly they all go back to a central point. That's where the Y chromosome atom. Now, how long ago did this happen? Well, modern mutation rates, we can measure them in family trees. It's like 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 mutations per generation. So your tiny little Y chromosome, it's only, I think, 65 million letters long. It's tiny. About 30 million, maybe 12 million are the ones we constantly sequence. It's easy to sequence that material. And in that, there's 1, 2, maybe 3 mutations per generation. That's biblical time. So the mutation rate is on our side. We don't need millions of years to explain the data. If Noah is somewhere in the middle, if we have 150 generations, you're going to get about 150, maybe 300 mutations, and that surrounds all the men in the world, except for a few outliers, which is normal in science. When you're doing something, you have an average, and some people are out here. Well, how do you explain that? Well, these outliers are the Khoisan Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, the pygmies in the Central African rainforest. They're small populations and have always been small populations. They're not like China, which is a massive population. They're outliers both genetically and population-wise. They're different. I highly suspect that they've simply had a higher mutation rate. Now, that's not a lot of mutations compared to the size of the entire genome. So to say that some people have a little more mutations than others, it's not that big a deal at all, because when you're talking about 65 million letters, 200 mutations versus 220 mutations, that's nothing. Percent difference is tiny. You can make the same argument with the mitochondrial DNA. In fact, the evolutionists knew that way back in 1998. They published a revised clock for mitochondrial Eve, and they said, oh my, Eve probably lived 6,000 years ago. It's published in the evolutionary literature. If you just look at the mutation rate. So they have to slow the mutation rates down. To get a mitochondrial Eve 200,000 years ago, to get a Y chromosome atom 1 to 200,000 years ago, they have to invoke ridiculously slow mutation rates that aren't scientific. We can measure the mutation rate. It's much too fast for them. It's very comfortable for us. Point number 2. Point number 3 is the fact that Y chromosome atom and mitochondrial Eve even exist. That's why we should believe in them. They exist. Adam, or Noah in this case, is somewhere in the middle of the Y chromosome tree. Eve, or the 3 daughters-in-law of Noah, are somewhere near the middle of the mitochondrial tree. But again, the mutation rates are such that we can easily encompass this and this in biblical time. Notice also that some of these branches are longer than the others. That means that from this common ancestor, some of the descendants have picked up twice as many mutations as others in the same amount of time. So just because you have a long branch doesn't mean the branch is older. It just means it's more different. Okay, I'm going to do something experimental here. Forgive me, I'm struggling with this. I want to share with you an idea, and I don't quite know how to explain it. I've only tried this a couple of times. So imagine that there is a population of human chimpanzees. We have not yet split into our human and chimpanzee in an evolutionary world. Okay, I'm just going to assume evolution for a moment. There's a population, they're not humans, they're not chimpanzees, they're our common ancestors. And in that population, there's going to be a bunch of individuals. And they're going to carry a diversity of mitochondria or a diversity of y-chromosomes, like this. Let's say it's type 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, they're different from each other, meaning that somewhere back in time, there's a common ancestor for these various types of y-chromosomes. Okay so far? Now this population is going to split into the population that will evolve into humans and the population that will evolve into chimpanzees. And we end up with something like this. If we want to do a common ancestor tree, it would look like this. So the common ancestor of, or let's say it this way, if you measure the length of these branches, you can measure how far apart two people are. The common ancestor of chimpanzee 1 and human 1 is, let's say, 2 units long. But if you want to go from chimpanzee 1 to chimpanzee 2, you have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 units long. This would mean that some chimpanzees are more similar to humans than they are to other chimpanzees. That's terrifying. Now, some of these are going to go extinct over time because of dumb luck, so maybe you find out a picture like this. Could you imagine the societal implications if we found some humans that were more similar to chimpanzees than other humans? Could you imagine if, let's say, to be really mean, let's say that number 1 is an African Y chromosome and number 5 is a European Y chromosome? Can you imagine what would have happened in history if we found that out? It was bad enough in the 20th century when the evolutionists were saying the Africans are less evolved than Europeans. Imagine if they had genetic evidence to suggest that was true. Evolution is not neutral for societies. Now, happily, wonderfully, this is not true. This is the evolutionary picture. Except all those things, those lines, they don't actually exist. We have no evidence for them, so this is reality. There's a human Y chromosome, there's a chimpanzee Y chromosome, and they're radically different from one another. In fact, the chimpanzee Y chromosome is only half the size. And even of the parts that we have in common, they're only about 70% similar. That's a lot of differences. 30% of 65 million letters, or actually 30 million letters, that's a lot. That's millions upon millions of letters. It would take a very long time to accumulate those differences. Therefore, they have to put Y chromosome Adam very far back. Because if they have him in the biblical time frame, it would take too long to get the chimp. They have to adjust all the branches and everything, their estimates of time, to account for evolutionary theory, but it actually doesn't work. There are some people today who are saying, no. Humans and chimps split not 3.5 million years ago that I was trained with. Commonly today they say 6.5 million years ago. Some people say 10 million years ago. Some people say, no, it's 11 to 17 million years ago. But they can't do that because if humans and chimpanzees are 11 to 17 million years, then you have to have gorillas and orangutans, and all of a sudden you have great apes in the time of the dinosaurs. So they have a limit to what they can do, and they're struggling with this. The Y chromosomes are very different. The mitochondria are very different. And I'm happy about that. I'm very happy that we have not found any weird human Y chromosomes or mitochondria. Even Neanderthals have a very human-like mitochondria because they are people also. They're not halfway between us and monkeys. Okay, point number 4. The fourth reason to believe in a biblical Adam and Eve is the amount of human genetic diversity that we have. Okay, ready? I'm assuming that you 6 people are not related, right? By blood. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7. That's 99% of the world's genetic diversity. Right there. Almost the entire world is sitting in these few people. Africa has more diversity than everybody else, so maybe it takes 5 people in Africa and maybe 7 people in China to get 99% of the world's genetic diversity. And most of the diversity that we carry doesn't cause disease. And if we share it amongst all the populations in the world, that means that it would have been in Adam and Eve. It would have been on the ark. It would have been at Babel. Because there hasn't been time in human history to spread like the blue-eyed gene across the entire world. It doesn't work like that. It would take millions of years for everyone in the world, every population, to have blue eyes if we didn't have the colonial era of European history. The amount of genetic diversity in the world is easy to explain in Adam and Eve. All we have to do is, I carry, because I've had my genome sequenced, and because I'm a nerd, I carry about 3 million places in my genome where the copy of DNA I got from my mother is different than the copy of DNA I got from my father. About 3 million. All of you carry about 3 million places unless you have unless you had cousins or second cousins that got married, which most of us do have in our family trees. You have about 3 million places. There's only about 10 million places like that in the entire world. So you alone carry 1/3 of the world's genetic diversity. Oh. Francis Collins again. There is no way you can develop this level of variation between us from 1 or 2 ancestors. Oh. Or his colleague, Dennis Venema. You would have to postulate that there's been this absolutely astronomical mutation rate that has produced all these new variations in an incredibly short period of time. Those types of mutation rates just are not possible. It would mutate us out of existence. Yes or no? Why? What mistake did they make? They assumed that all variation comes from mutation. They assumed that God did not create Adam and Eve with genetic diversity. They assume that you are just mutants, and everything in you that where your things different, those are mutations. Says who? So I wrote an article, The Non-Mythical Adam and Eve, Refuting Errors by Francis Collins and Biologos, and that is on creation.com, where I explain basically everything I just told you. Okay, the 5th reason to believe in an Adam and an Eve is a distribution of the variations that we have. The distribution. If you take all the mitochondria in the world, and I've got 56,000 of them on a folder here on my laptop. They're 1.6 KB. They're tiny little files. I have worked with them a lot. I have lined them up. I've done lots of statistical analyses. And one thing you can do is you can line up all the mitochondria. So 16,000 rows, 16,000 columns, 52,000 rows. And then you can have a computer program go down each column and say, okay, A-A-A-A-A-T, A-A-A-A-A-A-A-T, A-A-T, and the next one, G-G-G-G-G-G-G-C, G-G-G-G-G, and next one, C-T-C-T-T-C-C-C-C-T-T-T. And you can see how much variation is in each column. And when you do that, you can do a plot like this. You can calculate the frequency of the variance. So if 99% of the people in the world have an A in one column, but a couple of people have a G, well, that's going to give you a frequency of 1 to 2%. And you can see most of the variation is very rare. You know what this is a signal of? This is a signal of a rapidly growing population. For a population to grow, most people must have children. And if most people have children, the mutations they carry are more likely to be passed on. But because it keeps on growing and growing and growing, it's not likely that mutation is going to spread to a significant number of people. The fact that there are many rare variants is an indication of a rapidly growing population. There are some very common things out here, like 20% of the people have this letter, 25%, 30% have that letter. These are letters that are the differences in those branches I showed you in that tree. These are the things at the base of the branches. The 20% of the people are on this cluster. Well, that right there is one of these bumps here. That's not very helpful, though, because there's not enough data. So I went to the 1,000 Genomes Project. They actually have 2,000 human genomes. And I pulled all the chromosome 22s. Why? Because it's the shortest chromosome. It's easiest to work with. And I did the same thing for human chromosome 22. And that's what we see. A lot of very rare variation and very little very common variation. And this troubled me because I said, you know what? I know this is a signal of a rapidly growing population, but it's also a signal of a very old population. Because if you had like 1 million people for a very long time and it wasn't growing, you'd get a pattern sort of like that too. I was like, is this an evolutionary thing? Or is this creation? We start with Adam and Eve. How do you go to this? I mean, if there was a variant in Adam, he has 2 chromosomes, right? Let's say he has an A and a G. That's 50-50. There's hardly anything out here at 50-50. So how do we get that? Well, we have a computer program. It's called Mendel's Accountant. I didn't write it, but I worked with it a lot. It's a very sophisticated population modeling program where you can type in how large your population is, what's your mutation rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we modeled what we called an evolutionary population. Basically, it's 100,000 people for 100,000 years. And that's what the result was. Like, oh no, maybe human chromosome 22 is evolutionary. Maybe we're wrong. But then we said, okay, let's run several creation models. We'll do an evolutionary creation model where we have humans evolving. We'll pick 2 random people, kill off everybody else. We'll call those people Adam and Eve and let them keep on mutating and doing their thing. And then we said, okay, let's start with just Adam and just Eve. And whatever God puts into Adam, Eve is a clone. And then we'll let them start reproducing. And I said, okay, let's have another model. We'll call it the designed gametes model, where God could have put genetic diversity into Adam and Eve's reproductive cells. He could have put any amount of genetic diversity he wanted into Adam and Eve's reproductive cells. Therefore, the amount of diversity we see in the world today might reflect how many children they had. Well, that's interesting. But when we ran the other models, every single one of them was a better fit to the real data than the evolutionary model. That means that the distribution of the data fits a biblical story. In fact, it fits it better than the evolutionary story. The 6th reason to believe in a biblical Adam and a biblical Eve is that there is no molecular clock. I said that last night. I've already said it today, probably more than once. But when we look at the trees, we see irregular branch lengths. We see it all over the place, irregular branch lengths. And irregular branch lengths means that there's no clock. You can't look at a person and know how old their branch is. There's a biblical idea behind this. You've probably seen the lifespan curve of people after the flood and how rapidly our lifespan dropped after the flood. Well, I added to that. I added all the, not just Genesis chapter 11, but all the other people in the Bible where I know how many generations they are removed from Noah and how long they lived, as long as they didn't die in warfare or something. The last person is King Manasseh. That's how far it goes. We have known generation times and known lifespans. And when you do that, you get this beautiful exponential decay curve with an R-squared or a correlation coefficient. This is how well the line fits. A perfect fit is 1.0. A terrible fit would be like, 0.6. But 0.94, I have run scientific experiments where I was trying to get, and I would have loved to get a number 0.94. That's a very, very good correlation. This mathematical formula explains this very well. In other words, for each generation, the lifespan of the next person is about 88% of the lifespan of the person before, and eventually trails off. But the little reproductive cells in males, from puberty until the male dies, those cells keep on reproducing. They keep on dividing. And every time a cell divides, more mutations are possible. Ladies, it takes about 22 cell divisions from fertilization until the ovaries are complete with the eggs intact. Now, some of that is because the cells are outside the embryo, not dividing as the embryo is dividing. But it's about 22 cell divisions for those particular eggs. God is a genius. He took the egg cells and said, no, don't divide because that causes mutation. And he protected us by doing that. And the eggs invade the ovaries, and there's a couple of more cell divisions, and it's only 20, in other words, it's only 22 cell divisions from you to your child. Oh. Even weirder, when a woman is pregnant with a girl, there are 3 generations present. The mother, the girl, and the eggs in the ovaries of the baby. Therefore, smoking might affect the grandchild. Radiation poisoning might affect the grandchild. People might be affected by something that happened 70 years ago. Therefore, how does evolution work? Because all of a sudden the climate changes, and you might be affected by your grandmother, not by the climate. Just saying, okay, that's another story, another day. Males, and it's about 30 or 32 cell divisions before your reproductive cells are ready. And at puberty, they start to divide. They don't stop dividing until you die. So ladies, you don't pass on nearly as many mutations as men do. And the older a man gets, the more cellular divisions. We have measured this. It's a known factor. The number of mutations goes up with male's age. So I wrote a computer model where I estimated, using several different estimates, of the mutation load per generation, or per year actually, in an early post-flood population. So we start at the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They're 100 years old, I said, when the flood starts. And they're going to live till, I think, 650 is when Shem lived. And then their sons are going to live a little bit less. And their sons are going to live a little bit less. These dots, these are the average mutations per year in my model. That's average, meaning, yeah, some person might have been born with 1 or 2 mutations. Maybe 20 people are born with 1 or 2 mutations, and one person is born with 300 mutations. The average is maybe 5. And you can see that as those patriarchs start to die off, you don't get these upper levels anymore. You start going down to a normal average mutation rate of 1 to 3 mutations per generation. Oh. So right after the flood, we would predict if Shem or Arpachshad or Eber has a child late in life, that child will get a huge dose of new mutations. So the branches of the tree that are mutations, you might get boom, boom, instead of 100 years, 200 years. It's not necessarily, how do you say this? The length of the branch is not necessarily time. It's how old the father was when the child was born. And it's not one-to-one. If you have a child born when the man is 20 years old, and say he's 15 years of puberty, 5 years later he has a child. And the next generation happens, and the next generation, so the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son. For, let's say, 200 years. That's 10 generations. But then we have a son born when the man is 50. And that son has a son when he's 50. And that son has a son when he's 50. 4 generations. 4 generations, 10 times more mutations than 20 generations. The age of the father is a huge factor, and that should directly produce different branch lengths, and it should probably affect our lifespans. Because those fathers are pumping into our population children with lots and lots and lots of mutations. That too complicated? The last and final reason why you should believe in a biblical Adam and a biblical Eve is the Bible says it. We've read this before, Genesis 2:7, that the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. That is a direct statement. That's not written as poetry. That's not prophecy. There's not anything weird here. This is written just like history. And after that, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up his place instead. Oh, that's a King James. That's funny. Sorry for using the King James version. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made a woman, and he brought her unto the man. So we have an Adam, we have an Eve in the Bible. We have an Adam, we have an Eve in science. We have a young Adam and a young Eve in science. We have an Adam and an Eve that can explain all the genetic diversity that we see amongst people in the world. There's not a problem with 8 billion people or the genetic diversity we have. We have an Adam, we have an Eve, and we have one human family. The sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. I think that's enough. You want 8, 9, and 10 reasons? I think you've listened to enough. I hit you really hard and really fast. If you want more, I have a very similar talk to this one on creation.com. It's free. It's called The Historical Adam, Theological Conundrums, and Scientific Implications. You can go to creation.com, click on Store. You can look for Carter, look for DNA, genetics, historical Adam, something like that. You'll find it, and you can click on it. You have to say, okay, here's my name, whatever, but it's free. So it's a store link of a free video. I would also highly suggest my brand new video called Ancient DNA, Illuminating the Tapestry of Biblical Human History. The first one I filmed in my room with a webcam. This one, we filmed it in a studio professionally with a green screen, and it's very, very well done. And there's powerful information there to explain where we came from and what we're seeing in the archaeological record as far as DNA is concerned. And how do we take that and incorporate that into a biblical understanding of history? So I'll leave you with this. 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. You do it with a gentleness and respect. So let me ask you, do you have a better understanding of who Adam was, of who Eve was, and the theological importance that there was an Adam and an Eve? Do you understand that better? Do they have more of a central focus in your theology? So when you're talking to someone, they believe in evolution, you might not, hopefully you don't believe in evolution, but you might. I don't know everyone in this room. But let's say you're struggling with this and you're wondering and you're talking to this evolutionary person, what would you say to their evolutionary statements about human history? And when you say, no, I think we came from Adam and Eve, and they laugh at you, what's your response then? I mean, usually when someone laughs at you, you stop talking and you walk away with shame and face, right? I don't like being laughed at. I don't even put myself in positions deliberately while I'll be laughed at. I get thrown into them because I work for CMI, but I don't do it on purpose. So when someone laughs at you, what's your response now? You believe in Adam and Eve? Well, the amount of genetic diversity we see in the world easily fits in Adam and Eve. And the number of people easily fit in the biblical time frame. And there's a y-chromosome Adam and there's a y-chromosome Eve, just like the Bible predicts. Mr. Evolutionist, you got problems, not me. And walk away. Okay? I'm just going to stop early. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay. Should we do questions?
That's fine.
No, should I open up the floor to questions?
Sure, if you like to do some.
Do I have 15 minutes?
Yeah, you do.
All right. Let's do something fun. I don't promise that I know lots of answers to questions, but I love answering questions. I'm not going to promise that I have a great answer, but I'm going to try to point you in a direction where more answers lie, where better answers might lie. But if we open up this floor, can we do ourselves a favor? And let's be careful not to ask theological questions like free will versus predestination or end times theology or men versus women or Bible translations or you know those questions, right? But if you ask me a question, I promise I'll try to answer it, but please don't ask me anything about COVID-19. because it doesn't matter how I answer, someone in the room will get mad. And I'd rather not go there. Okay? All right, let's go. First question. Sir?
This relates to your earlier talk.
Yep.
You explained about races. Could that also be explained?
Oh,
Could the races also by evolutionary people who support evolution be explained through the newer look on the Darwinian synthesis, like the switching on and off of genes? Is that a clear question?
Can the races be explained with evolutionary theory?
Yeah, by the switching on and off of genes.
Usually the races are attempted to be explained in evolutionary theory by natural selection driving gene frequencies up or down, not epigenetics, which is switching on and off.
Yeah.
So dark skin in Africa is seen as a survival advantage, and light skin in Europe is seen as a survival advantage. And when those mutations occurred, they were amplified over time.
Yeah.
So I don't have problems with some of that. I mean, I believe in natural selection. It's just the origin of the diversity I put into Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I thought there was a newer explanation. There's like a new idea of the way genes work, that you can switch them on and off, and therefore it opens up for more possibilities than mutation, etc. That was yeah.
It is true that genes switching on and off will affect the phenotype, or the way organisms look and behave.
Mm-hmm.
And it is true, if you mutate those spots, you can change on and off patterns. But that's not classical Darwinism. That's a newer version where they're trying to bring in new information. It actually complicates the picture very much. It makes it harder for them to explain things.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Dun, dun, dun. Oh, okay. I was going to say, there's no sense in standing here if there's no questions. We'll just stop. But a couple more.
Is it CMI that is developing the continuous environmental tracking as a alternative to natural selection at places where organisms change really rapidly? Within 3 generations, cave fish lose their eyes, that kind of thing. Is that CMI looking at that too?
That is not us. There is an organization called the Institute for Creation Research. That was actually that was my first job in creationism. That Henry Morris started ICR, the Institute for Creation Research. The new director is Randy Galuza. I have very strong disagreements with Dr. Galuza about continuous environmental tracking. Some of what he says is absolutely brilliant. He says organisms were created with sensors, environmental sensors, and they make decisions based on what they're sensing. Chemical cues, light cues, food, decision making, even bacteria make decisions, which way to turn and things like that. Where I disagree with him is his suggesting that natural selection is not real, that people are trying to make nature a living entity, that nature is doing selecting, which no one ever believed. I actually have a video that's going to come out very soon, and I know I have it on my YouTube channel on biblical genetics. It's called Natural Selection in Paradise, where I go through how natural selection works without sin and death in the world. And that even in a God-created universe with no sin and no death, you're still going to get environmental changes. And you're still going to have genetic diversity. So any organism that's reproducing with the environment changing, that's going to cause natural selection. Without death, it's just some will reproduce faster than others. So CMI very reluctantly has taken a pretty firm stance against continuous environmental tracking, even though half of it is absolutely brilliant. It's the other half that we're not big fans of. So thanks for making me say something about somebody else bad anyway. 1 or 2 more? Oh, lady in the back. Ma'am.
Hello. I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm going to ask anyway. I have a Norwegian mom, and I have an Australian dad. I just found out 16 months ago who my dad was.
Wow.
And that's interesting, because we have been building the relationship. Now he lives in Norway. But at the amount of time I've known him now, it feels like I've known him my whole life. And that's interesting. Because when I dove into this DNA testing thing, and I found on black on white on the sheet of paper that told me he was my dad, 99.9999%. I had more like scores like the CT and GC and stuff similar to him than to my mom.
But not much more.
No, not much more,
Yeah.
but significantly.
Yeah.
And that tells me something I now know, that I have always looked more like him and felt more like him than my mom. And that's interesting because it's like 50% from my mom and 50% from my dad. But is it, okay, here's my question.
Okay, question.
I thought now I have forgotten how to formulate it. I'm sorry. There was a formulation here somewhere.
Okay.
I lost track.
Well, let me talk for a minute,
Yes.
and then you might think of your question.
Yeah.
And this will be the last question. When chromosomes line up, they recombine. But they don't recombine exactly in the same place all the time. And you're never exactly 50% mom or 50% dad. In fact, you're definitely not 25% of each of your grandparents. You get different chunks from your grandparents of different sizes. Eventually, about 5 generations before you, there's people in your family tree that you're not actually descended from. After 10 generations, 99% of your ancestors aren't actually your ancestors. You have none of their DNA.
Interesting. That's interesting.
So it's fun stuff happening in genetics. Okay, do we have a question? Okay. Okay. All right, let's leave it there. All the speakers will be around for questions later. You want to come up? Thank you so much for listening. I know that was complicated, but I hope I helped somebody. Thank you.
Er den på? Der kom du, vet du. Ja, det er spennende med genetikk, og den er med å bidra til at vi kan stå enda mer frimodig som kristne og troende på Bibelen. Og så må det jo være greit, da, synes jeg, at Gud la inn all denne variasjonen i Adam og Eva. Altså, hvis dere har vært på en gate hvor alle husa ser like ut, så ser det noe ganske kjedelig ut, og vi hørte jo litt tidligere i forhold til biene at de klarer jo ikke å se fargen rødt engang, så hvorfor i all verden finnes det røde blomster? Gud, han er glad i vakre ting, han er glad i variasjon. Og det gjør at du kan se på deg selv også, uansett hvem du er, om du føler deg litt annerledes enn andre, og kjenne at du er verdifull. Fordi Gud, han liker variasjon. Han skapte deg akkurat som du er, fordi at han synes det er godt. Det er godt å ta med seg, tenker jeg. Ja. Da skal vi ha en kort pause da, til klokka er 5. Hvor vi skal få høre Stephen Austin her, og så er det kveldsmat.